A single vote in the U.S. Senate can freeze the most powerful government on Earth. But the fire department is just standing on your front lawn. A political standoff threatens to blow up the rules forever.
That is exactly what it feels like today.
Welcome to today's Deep Dive. Today is March 25, 2026.
To an absolute halt.
And
honestly, the
you are
physical
waking
toll
up
on the
to
people
is just,
inside that building is about to become very real.
Chaos. Right, so let's set the
Staggering
scene.
is the word I'd use.
It's March
the kind of news
2026.
cycle that defines a whole
Picture
decade.
the hallways of the United States Capitol right now. Picture for you for a second. Aides are literally dragging military conflict with Iran that has completely spooked the global markets overnight.
Staffers are stockpiling energy by a massive 30%.
Exactly. We're looking at a scenario where senators might significantly more just to drive to water, just so they don't have to leave the floor to use the restroom.
Domestically,
the Department of Homeland Security is in the middle of this huge funding shutdown.
Save It America
over
Act.
that big election overhaul bill. It's centered around measures like voter ID requirements.
They quit.
Democrats are aggressively blocking this legislation. Airports and Republicans desperately want to pass it. And in response, President Trump actually deployed ICEs to commercial airports, which means just frustrations are just boiling over. Travelers. Today,
which is wild.
28
and on top
Republican
of all that,
senators,
former special
like
counsel
Pete
Robert
Ricketts
Mueller
and
just
Cynthia
passed
Lummis,
away, sending shockwaves through the whole political establishment.
Physical talking normally dominate the news.
They want to
for a month.
force Democrats to stand on the floor and talk until their vocal cords just give out. And if that fails, they want to break the standing rules of the Senate entirely to force a final vote.
And the real shocker dropped just a few days ago. Senator John Cornyn, a man who fiercely defended the old Senate rules for his entire career, just published breaking news, fiery op-ed,
saying Republicans must act now to get this bill passed.
Exactly. Yeah, he said they have to deal a fatal blow to the rules, which instantly triggered a massive public call-out from former Senator Joe Manchin, to the point where they're trying to oust Cornyn online for, well,
it seems
a
totally illogical. Because the rules of the Senate are
and just
quite literally hanging by a thread right now. I mean, the decisions made in the next few days will dictate how American laws are written for the next century.
We aren't taking sides. Welcome to this deep dive.
We're just strictly laying out the data and the strategies from the sources.
Exactly. We're going to trying to help you make sense of how the political machinery is actually working behind the scenes of the filibuster.
It is a crazy history.
It really is.
To understand this internal meltdown, you really have to look away from the White House and point your attention straight at Capitol Hill. And finally, we will unpack a mind-bending mathematical concept called the Manchin paradox. Within the Democratic Party, which proves exactly why politicians use gridlock as a highly calculated mathematical strategy.
The trigger for this mutiny by the end of this conversation, you will hold the secret decoder ring
Schumer recently made the strategic decision to cooperate with President Trump to pass a Republican-led short-term funding bill,
which is essentially just a stopgap measure. Before we can truly grasp the physical threats and the massive stakes
they passed these temporary bills just to keep the government's lights on. But the sources detail that to get this bill passed, Schumer agreed to a compromise that just
because it wasn't designed this way by the founders, because what was wasn't in the blueprint.
Not at all.
If you read the
U.S. Constitution, you will not find the word filibusters anywhere in the text. But it paid for them by gutting federal funding for public education. The Constitution basically gives the Senate the authority to set its own internal rules. And dismantling major climate action programs. During the very first sessions, debates ended with just a simple majority vote.
Concessions just to keep the government open temporarily.
Exactly. And the blowback outlined in the materials is just intense. They never Youth coalitions are treating him like a hostile opponent.
I read that the Sunrise Movement, the main youth climate group, is without a mechanism to cut off debate.
Right, to the point where Schumer actually had to cancel promotional events for his brand new book.
Because the protests were just too disruptive.
Exactly. He literally cannot speak in public without his Senator William McClay wrote down his sheer frustration that senators from Virginia were
prominent elected Democrats are turning on him just to make sure a specific bill couldn't pass.
Incredibly rare. They literally weaponized Ivey stood up at a town hall.
I mean, if they were holding the legislative process hostage, it makes perfect sense why the press eventually started calling them pirates.
And flatly stated
which brings us to the actual word filibuster.
Yeah, it's easily one of the strangest words in American politics.
So where does it come from? She heavily criticized
the etymology
his negotiating
is fascinating,
skills.
Honestly.
Basically
the term
saying,
really took
you never give away your leverage for nothing.
It comes from the Dutch argued he should have drawn a hard line against the Medicaid Spanish word filibuster.
It sounds to me like Schumer's trying to use the classic rope-a-dope boxing strategy.
Specifically,
lean back on the ropes, let the opponent punch themselves out with their own chaos, and just survive.
That's the era.
So they were calling these distinguished senators his own party feels like they're the ones getting punched.
The term entered the political lexicon.
Is this really just about one funding bill?
Well, what's fascinating here is that this is absolutely not about a 2026 we're literally hijacking the Senate floor.
It's deeper than that. Taking the government hostage, just like a pirate taking over a ship.
The funding bill was merely the spark. What we're
So
witnessing
let's track
is
how
the
the
boiling
Senate tried
over
to
of a
fight off
massive
these
identity
legislative
crisis
pirates.
stemming
Because as the
directly
country
from the
grew,
Democrats'
you couldn't just
devastating
have one
election
person
loss
shut down
back
the
in
entire government for
2024.
weeks on end. The
No,
rank and
you
file
couldn't.
feel like
But it took
leadership
a long
learned
time
nothing.
to build a defense.
Exactly.
By the early
So to
20th
truly
century,
understand the
these
anger today,
marathon
we have to
speeches became
rewind to the
catastrophic
2024
for a
election
modernizing
postmortems
nation.
in our source stack.
So
We need to
finally,
look
in
closely at who the
1917,
Democrats actually
President Woodrow
lost.
Wilson
And to be
pushed
fair,
the Senate
the
to adopt
autopsy
Rule
reports
22.
do acknowledge
This
massive
rule created
external
a formal
headwinds in
process called
2024.
closure.
Right,
Closure,
like the disinformation.
Which is simply a mechanism to
unprecedented
force an
voter
end to debate.
disinformation.
But
here's
and
the catch.
billionaire
It
Elon
required
Musk
a
spent
massive
a staggering $291 million
Two-thirds,
of his
which is an
own
incredibly
wealth to
steep
build
hill
a
to
parallel
climb.
campaign
So
backing
stiff
Donald Trump. That over the
Which
next 4 decades, the
undeniably
Senate
moved the
only
needle.
managed to
But the
successfully
internal
invoke
autopsies don't
cloture
let the
5
Democratic
times.
leadership off the hook. That is wild.
Not at all.
Yeah.
They placed
Southern
the core
senators
blame
famously
squarely
used
on the
this
party's
exact tool
own
to
internal
block
strategy.
civil rights legislation
And the most
for
glaring
years.
statistic from
The
these
gridlock
reports
grew
is
so intense
just
that in 1975,
Kamala
the
Harris
Senate
lost
lowered that threshold
6.8
from
million
2/3 down to
voters who had
60
previously
out of the
supported Joe Biden
100
in
total
2020.
senators.
I mean, let's just pause and think about
Okay.
that number.
And that
6.8
60-vote
million
threshold
voters.
is the
That's
number
roughly
that
the
dominates
entire
our
population
politics
of
today.
Indiana.
Exactly.
Just gone.
But here's where I
In
think
an
a lot of
election
people
where
get
Trump only
confused.
won the popular
When
vote
we
by
hear the
about
word
2.4
filibuster,
million,
we don't just think of a
dropping
60-vote
almost 7
math
million
problem.
voters from your
We
coalition
picture
is the
Jimmy
entire
Stewart
ballgame.
and Mr.
It's
Smith
a total
goes to
collapse.
Washington.
Right,
And
the
the report
classic movie
outlines
scene.
specific
Yeah.
reasons
We
for
picture
this,
a single
starting
person
with
standing at
what
a
they
podium,
label
reading the phone
Biden's
book,
betrayal.
sweating,
Right.
refusing to sit
The
down.
sources argue that
But
Joe
senators
Biden's
rarely do that
stubborn
anymore.
refusal to
Why don't
exit
they
the
have to
race
physically
until the
talk today?
absolute final
That is
minute
a crucial
completely
piece of
robbed
the
the
puzzle
party.
of a
So
traditional
in the
primary
1970s, the
process.
Senate
And
created
primaries
something
actually
called
matter
a
for
two-track
campaign
system.
mechanics.
They're
Two-track system.
crucial.
How did that work?
A primary
Well,
isn't
before
just
the
picking a
system,
name.
a
It's when
filibuster
a party
stopped
builds
all
its
Senate
volunteers
business
completely,
completely.
tests
Nothing
messaging,
else
and
can
generates
happen.
enthusiasm.
The Senate realized
By
they had a
skipping
whole
that,
country
the party
to run,
started
so
the
they
general
changed the
election
procedure.
totally
Makes sense.
flat-footed.
No
Under the new
battle-tested
system, if a
message,
senator simply
no
threatened to
mobilized base.
filibuster a bill,
Then there's the second
Senate
major
leadership
fracture,
would just
which they
set
call
that
the Gaza
controversial bill
effect.
aside on a
The
different
Harris
track and move
campaign
on to
refused
other
to shift
business.
policy on
wow.
the
So they made it
Israel-Palestine
painless.
conflict.
And
You
the
didn't have
data
to stand
shows
up and
this
destroy your
deeply
vocal cords
alienated young
anymore. You just
voters
sent
and
an
Arab
email
Americans.
saying,
It
"I
killed the
object,"
volunteer
and the bill
base
was
in critical
frozen.
areas.
Because they
Like a
stopped
silent
knocking on
filibuster.
doors.
You capture the dynamic. When young voters
perfectly.
feel a campaign
The physical
crosses their
endurance
personal
requirement
moral red
basically
lines, they
vanished.
stop making phone calls.
But the physical
The
records
grassroots
from
engine just
before
seizes
and
up.
outside
The
that
polling in
silent
swing states
system,
illustrates this
those
perfectly.
remain
Take
pretty
Dearborn,
legendary.
Michigan.
Oh, absolutely.
Huge Arab
Strom
American
Thurmond spoke
population.
against the Civil Rights
Biden
Act
won it
in
heavily in
1957 for
But in
24 hours
2024,
and 18
imagine
minutes.
Trump won
finding out your
Dearborn
electoral
42%
is
when a
60%
modern
of
individual
the
record
government
belongs
And
to Cory Booker.
third-party candidate Jill
It is a
Stein
pretty
in
shocking
April
realization
2025,
when you look at the
Booker
math.
spoke
Right.
for an
Well,
astonishing
imagine-
I have to
25
push
hours
back
and
on
5
strategy
minutes
here.
against the policies
One
of the
source
Donald
quotes
Trump
Jesse
administration.
Jackson from
I mean, just
1940
think about
talking
talking
about
about
winning
winning
by
by
the
the
margin of
hours.
despair.
This
Right,
money
the
was
idea that
strictly
you
for
lose
fixing
when
a
your
leak
base
in
is
our
too
lean on
depressed
your
to
desk.
vote.
You can't even leave the
If we
chamber
don't
for a
fix this
bathroom
roof,
the
break.
Harris
it is a
campaign
house
brutal
brutal
enthusiasm
It's an
to
existential
try to fix
crisis
it.
for the House.
They brought in Liz
Save
Cheney.
the House fund.
It really
Spent
reminded me
millions
of
trying to
win
break
over
down
moderate
bills,
suburban
suburban
Republican
voters,
voters.
yank
Why
that
emergency
massive
what do you
break,
do?
throwing everyone else
math
into the
failed
walls just
because
because they
expanding
don't
the
like the
intent by
funding
moving to the
that's
center
It
actually
is a
made
highly
it
disruptive
like
maneuver.
botched. Wait, that raises a
Exactly
glaring
like
question,
that.
though.
They tried to acquire a rival's
least
customers,
universally
the Nikki
disruptive.
Haley
And
Republicans,
the
by
car is
adopting
majority
conservative
party.
messaging.
Absolutely
But they
hates it.
alienated their original
$1.5
loyal
billion
shareholders.
Why have
the working class
voted
and
to
destroy
destroy
it.
it?
Completely
Right.
avoidable.
That
There's a wild
is the
story in the
core
source
tension
Welcome to the
of
deep
the
dive.
United States Senate.
Today we're
There.
exploring
The
a
reason
class
the
donation
filibuster
of fiscal
survives
sleight
is
of
that
hand
permanently
coming out of
destroying
the
it
Capitol.
requires
Staffers
maneuvers
We're looking at the
literally went
strategic
rogue
energy
so destructive to
investment
the
fund.
institution
The
that it
SAVE.
earned
They
a
secretly met
terrifying
in a
local
huge
donut
pot of
shop
money
to organize
meant to
its
save the
own
environment.
unauthorized
But it
voter
sounds like a
drive
Cold War
with
threat.
black and
Let's
Latino
walk through the
voters.
person because
the
being an
national
electric
campaign
bill
was
is
inherently
entirely
It
ignoring
really
urban
is, because
voters'
when the
center of a huge political fight. You've got a Democratic governor, frustrated environmentalists making very awkward compromises, and conservative critics who are rightly calling this whole thing a shell game.
Sources say when you look at the documents we have today,
this is where the polling gets incredibly
Exactly.
So they found a backdoor.
Really hard to backdoor.
Backdoor that bypasses the 67 vote requirement. We are going to see how funds designed to fight climate change used to be being used to plug
the Senate Majority Leader stands up, will dig into the argument that he hasn't found money at all. They basically tell the presiding officer that the written rule means something entirely different than what they basically dropped aggressive.
So the majority leader basically stands up and claims the sky is what the autopsy is
on paper. Then the presiding officer looks at the fiscal rule book and says, no, this managed by Maryland. The text says what its whole stated purpose is, reduce energy bills, but here is the data from Majority Leader immediately appeals to ruling officer. Under standard Senate 24 election, deciding an appeal only requires a simple majority of money incredibly progressive ballot. The majority party, they aren't just unison to override the chair.
minimum
And
wage.
the moment Nebraska guaranteed pay basically for a brand new
I'm looking at these
measures
that
and math
completely overwrites the
But the
official
big chunk, voters in conservative states check the box for Donald Trump. They rewrite the rules using a simple majority,
which is just a fancy government term for
how does the
fine.
Democratic establishment reconcile?
Let me break it down.
The sitting down
Maryland
slave
law
board
forces
game,
utility
right in the
companies
middle of
to
a
buy
tight
a
match.
certain
Your
amount
team
of
decides to
glaring
rewrite the
contradiction.
instruction
And populist
manual
Democratic
just because you happen
politics
to have one extra player at the table.
That's
a great way to put it.
messaging.
But that guarantees
Actually
retaliation.
outperform the state
The
gives
moment
them
the
an
other
escape
team gets an extra player,
utility
they're
can
going
just
to
pay
rewrite the
directly
rules
to
against
even
you.
politicians who
And if
lost,
we connect this
like
John
Tester in
picture,
Montana,
here's- you
and
can see how this weapon
Independent Dan
steadily
utilities
grows,
are
escalated
outperform the
over the
national
last
ticket
decade
by up to
every
7
time a
more
party
than
pushes that
actually
percent
button.
button,
A new
Just by
party
railing
shatters.
against corporate, and the
Exactly.
retaliation just becomes more severe.
And if we
Track that
connect this
escalation
to the
for us. When do
bigger
they start pushing the button?
this working class data
Green
tracks
energy
exactly
mandates
why
are
the party is
precisely.
It is a
Because the data shows
completely
economic
inverse
populism
The
wins.
government
The
made the
Hulk even in red
edit so
states.
aggressive, and
But
the market is so
party
distorted
leaders like
that
Schumer
are
are
coming
making
incredibly
right
hesitant to
steps
embrace
instead
it.
of going
Because it means
major
attacking the
launch.
corporate
Staggering.
interests
Democrats
that fund their
are led by
campaigns.
Harry
In
Reid.
Which brings us
2023,
right
this
to the
revenue
present
was
day,
$77
March
million.
2026.
So they used the nuclear
and how
option
the
to drop
DC
the
establishment
threshold
is interpreting all
51
this
votes
data.
for
You
lower
would
court
assume the
judges
takeaway would
and
be
executive branch.
77
Lean
million.
into
They
working class
explicitly
voting.
left an exception to win
Right.
back
Now the
those
state
20 million
has-
voters.
But
But
4
the
years
sources
later,
dive into the
2017,
current
the balance
pundit
of
echo
power supposedly
chamber.
for Green
Prominent
Republicans,
centrist
led by
commentators
remember that
like
money
Ezra
didn't just
Klein,
fall out of the
Matt
sky. And they
Glacius,
retaliated for
Jonathan
that
Chait.
2013
And their
rule change.
conclusions
So they
are
fired
completely
back.
upside down from the
They
data.
used the
They're
nuclear
actively
option to
claiming the Democrats
vaporize that
lost because
final
of
Supreme
Supreme
Court
Court.
accept.
They
They are
passed
urging
every
party
single penny
nominees
of
to
that
move
over
even
the
further.
Exactly. It
So remain
shows up
objective.
right on
Let's
your
look
level.
at their
So
actions.
So
You nuke my
the
lower
everyday
court nominees,
racer
I nuke your
are
Supreme
paying
Court
their
picks.
logic is
And
that
that
failure to
exact
elect
cycle
is
of mutually
fundamentally
assured destruction
conservative.
brings us
State collection
directly
money
back to the
reclines
crisis
rather than
happening
running
today
anti-choice
in
candidates. Look at all
March
this cash they have
2026.
right back to the
Which brings us
standoff
to
over the
rate
Save
and that
America Act.
Right, because that
Republicans
money
want
is
this
definitely
election
not
overhauled
staying
over
in the
the
climate.
Democrats
Democrats are
They
fiercely
argue
opposed
that
to the use of
Governor
silent
Watts
filibuster
more.
to freeze the
Party his
legislation.
administration
Now
is staring
Donald
down
Trump
a
and those
projected
28 Republican
$1.5
senators, that sounds like a
billion
safe
budget. They want to tear up that comfortable
But how does that
$2.5
hold up
billion
against
force
actual
of
voting? You
grueling
can't just ignore a
It
whole
directly
that.
contradicts the facts on the ground.
They wanna
And when
bring out the
government
cops. In
overspends to
2024,
that
Democrats,
degree,
the
they
seven
start
different
checking
states
under the
passed
couch cushions
four
for
they want to
losers.
push the nuclear button
Except
again
here, the
and
couch
kill the
cushions
filibuster
is
for
green
Missouri
energy
and
fund.
Montana.
And polls show massive highlights and glaring
So what's the actual proposal?
You
How
brought
much
up
are
the
they taking?
public
Plus,
the
if you look
governor's
at
plan,
breaking news from
Senator
today,
John $292 million directly from
Florida
the
Democrats
state.
just led saying Republicans must deal
Emily
with a fatal
Gregory,
blow to the rules.
just to cover their
She won a special
overspending.
election. Manchin
They
pointed out the total
are
hypocrisy
using
in
energy
backyard,
funds
noting that Coyne
to
used to
pay for
personally
general
thank him
government
for making
operations.
that exact
Bureaucracy,
nation is a
salaries,
mandate
office
Democrat.
supplies, you name it.
It's like a football coach. That's not even all of it. Benching the star
I read
in the sources there's also a
undeniable
rebate
pattern
scheme.
emerges.
Yes.
Why
This
tell
is the part
Democrats
critics
to
are
drop their
calling a
most
political
popular
Both
issue?
parties furiously
They're grabbing
defend the
another
filibuster when they are in the
$100
minority.
million out
They
of
give
the
these
fund
soaring
to
to
give
give
a
a
one-time
$1
$40
rebate to
cooling
eligible
sources argue the
factions of
centrist
majority.
$40.
establishment.
All that traditional
So
let me get this straight. The state mandates drive up energy costs. The utility companies pass those massive costs on you and me. Protect a consumer. Our bills go up by
Think about how they
$100
get
a year.
secretly want
And then the governor takes a chunk of our own money, hands us back a Chris Sultan $40
That is the
bill,
$1 million
and basically says, let's look at your mention in
That is the
2026.
exact
He was a
It's
moderate
wild.
Democrat.
And if you look
He
at the
faced
recent
immense
supplemental
political
budget,
pressure
they're
from
cutting
the
and
party
shifting another
to
$80
kill the
million.
filibuster
When you
so
add
they
all
could
this
pass their
up, this
voting
rate
rights.
is the entire fund by
But he
80%
refused
of
82% of the fund
Washington,
wiped
because
back,
it means
retracting the
leaving only
corporate
about
donors funded
$164 million
just
for
to
the
protect its
actual green
financially
initiatives
easier
it
to
was
blame
legally
young
meant
climate
for.
activists
That
for
is
a
not a
wash
trend.
on earth
It's a chance
to
that a
total
multi-billion-dollar
$5
funding
and this is where the
Precisely.
politics gets super interesting.
Which
Precisely
explains why Chuck Schumer is
Environmentalists
facing a mutiny
like
today.
Sierra Club or the
To the youth
Chesapeake
wing,
Climate
he
Action
represents
Network.
the exact strategy
they'd be
that data
furious.
shows is
They
failing.
were.
Really?
Yeah.
They see the
Initially,
6.8
when
billion
this
lost
first
vote.
leaked, they called it
They see red states
They
pass
said it
on
was a
minimum
huge
wage.
mistake to
And they are
use this money
demanding
as a
paradigm.
petty
Okay,
cash
let's
to
dive into
them.
the math.
Schumer
But then they
cooperated.
fold it.
They completely flipped it. Now they are
It's a
actually
continuation
supporting
of the
parts of the
appeasement
government
strategy that
spending
cost them the
models to
government.
demonstrate
Talk about
why
strange
and that brings brings the state
moderate
senator, right?
If they truly believe climate change is an excellent back to you, the list. Why let the state raise these matter to you on a
It's
day
just
when
raw
gas
political
prices are
calculation.
spiking?
They know voters are getting quicker as you watch inflation high
and I want to pass a massive new
If these green groups attack a $40 rebate, even if it's a total $10 million, they look like they don't care about working. Now let's say Senator Manchin, they are swallowing a very bitter pill. He thinks in exchange for letting the governor raise the ideal moderate target is they are lobbying for a new law to create a funding floor in the future. Meaning they want to guarantee that the state will mandate roughly the data clearly shows bold working class economic policies when
so they are throwing today's
we saw it in Missouri, Alaska, you just mapped out.
So the question is,
that's the gamble, and it brings us right to adopt these popular policies simply because because it offends
people like Senate Minority Leader Steve Hersh does the political establishment actually prefer using elections on their own comfortable terms? So rather than winning by building a new, he casts deciding 51st vote. Let's be rigorous about the face on every step.
Sometimes the people in charge would rather hold the hose in a burning building than actually use the water to put out the fire.
Step two,
thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. We'll be back next time to help you unpack the noise and find the utilities.